Okay, so we know that we will have more people join in, and I'll let them in as they arrive. But in the meantime, let's go ahead and get started. So tonight we're going to discuss the text Black Like Me, which I think has a lot to uncover and really offers a nice new layer to our conversations that have developed over the months. And tonight I decided to invite a guest who, we talked a lot about perspective, and I feel like we would all be in agreement that it is very difficult to gain perspective because of our limited access of being, and this is where you fill in the blank, a woman of color, or a white woman, or a Black woman, or whatever that looks like. And so what I feel like we haven't had the chance to hear a lot from is the perspective of a Black man who might have insight, who does have insight on experiences of what it is to be a Black man, especially during similar time frames of what we've been discussing, and what Griffin discusses in his social experiment. And so tonight I would like to welcome Marty Watkins. He is here for us right here from Decatur. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Marty, and then we're just going to allow him the freedom to talk to us. He's had a little perspective about what we're doing. And as usual, it's very informal. So certainly as he's talking, I guess, think back about our conversations, think about your read of Black Like Me, and I guess just really start to think about, what kinds of inquiries we would have for Marty. He's a very wonderful open text, I would say. He's a great community member, and I was so grateful that he, willingly gave his time to us tonight. So Marty was born right here in Decatur in 1962, and he attended the Decatur Public Schools. He was actually part of the desegregation movement in the 60s, where he was bused to John Quincy Adams Elementary School that was located in the now South Shores, or it was South Shores, now Garfield. And he also provided me a little bit more information about his community involvement. So he did graduate from Eisenhower, and after that he attended Martin University, where he got his bachelor's in religious studies. He has was a candidate for the Macon County Board in 2017, and also ran for the Decatur City Council. He sits on quite a few boards right here in the community, and as I said, is really active in our community. And so without further ado, I want to allow Marty the stage to share what he's ready to share, and here's hopeful for another night of great conversation. So thank you guys for joining us.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you, Leah, for the opportunity, and thank members of the book club for lending me their ears on such a dynamic topic. I had a chance to briefly look for John Howard Griffin's book, Black Like Me, and it's kind of interesting, especially being a black male growing up in the era. I was born in 1962, of course. When John did his experiment, it was in 1959, and during that time, we still had the race tension going on. And Julia earlier, I was part of the desegregation movement. At that time, we were bused from South Jackson Street, which our elementary school at that time would have been in Washington, but we were bused from Jackson Street across shores to John Quincy Adams, and that was in the years 1968, 1969. And it's kind of ironic that when I was reading about John, this happened to him almost 50 years ago, so it really hasn't been that long. Growing up in Decatur, I've experienced some issues myself. And one thing I read about a comment made in John's book was that a person, once they read the book, they said, "Oh, I get it." But then they further said, "No, I don't get it." It's hard to be able to understand another person's perspective if you've never lived in that perspective or walked in a person's shoes. So I thought it was a tremendous book and a tremendous experiment to share with you some of the things that I, as a Black male, have experienced. And that is, I could be walking through a crosswalk, and there could be an elderly couple sitting in their vehicle. And as soon as I start to go right in front of vehicles, I could hear the car lock. And, they would automatically just lock cars. Growing up here in Decatur in the 70s, people were still using the N-word. I remember being called that several times, traveling from one part of the town to the next, and I would always travel under what is called the Jasper Street Viaduct. Probably know where that's located. And there would be people come through there, and they would, as a Black kid, they would holler at me and call out the N-word. Sometimes there were cans thrown at me. So that was one of the things I experienced as a kid. And as I shared with Julia, in the 80s, I was a senior Eisenhower High School, and I was actually pulled over by two white officers, and they immediately drew their weapon out. I had school books in my hand, and so I immediately threw my hands up in the air, and school books and paper went everywhere. And I knew to do that for the simple fact that I was part of the Macon County Sheriff's Cadet. It was like a police exposure program for the youth in the community. In the 90s, I worked for the Department of Correction. And in the 90s, I lost my employment due to the fact that I was accused of being a gang member. Now, prior to going to the Illinois Department of Corrections, I had spent several years with the Macon County Sheriff Department. So if the background check had been done like it's supposed to be done, then they would have found out this allegation was false. So I did fight the case, and I won. I ended up suing the state of Illinois Department of Correction, and I won. Because of that, there's laws now on the book that says that Department of Correction must give every trainee union representation. And so if you have any questions about that, how it came about, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. But what happened is that there were some co-workers who were white, and they went on the town. They had got intoxicated, destroyed some property, and they were given the opportunity to make restitution to the property owners, but they kept the job. And I was terminated on the fact that someone thought I was a gang member. And so But those are some of the things that I had experienced in the 90s. And even this day, as a Black man, I know that when I put on a suit, I get a lot of respect. But if I put on jeans, if I want a pair of jeans, a regular shirt, you can see the difference. You can actually feel the difference. So those are some of the things I experienced as a Black man. And so I don't know right now if there anyone has any questions to what I've said as far. Please feel free to chime in. Excuse me. No questions. So here's a question that we must all ask ourselves is, how did we get here? How did we get to the point of where we have all this racial tension, and where did discrimination come from, and why is this being practiced? Because if we look at the United States Declaration of Independence, it says that all men are created equal. So somewhere down the line, we have gotten away from that. The American dream is not being able to be obtained like the United States Declaration of Independence says, that that all men, that we have the rights, these inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So I think I can stop right there and see if anyone has any input, conversation. I know it's a touchy subject, but it's something that we all have to come to grips with, because all of us have some type of prejudice in us, but we must find out, why do we hold such prejudice, or do we have such prejudice? So it's our self-examination. Why do you feel toward a certain individual? Is it something that's been passed down, or why do you feel the way you feel? So,
Marty, what we might do is enter a conversation, if you don't mind, about the book. And I feel like that might help us, come up with a few questions along the way, if you don't mind that.
No, go right ahead.
Okay. So I want to just open the floor, I guess, to begin conversation about the book and different perspectives. I guess I'll start with, I know one person commented that Griffin's account seemed very sensational. Any perspective on, I mean, clearly this is, in the 60s, and so it is a different context than maybe now. And maybe there is a bit of sensationalism to the way that he writes. And maybe that's with purpose. So, and is it effective, I guess? What are your thoughts on that? I guess the way that he writes, the experiment that he did, why he decided to do it.
Yeah, I guess the way that, go ahead, sorry.
This is Ouija. I remember, I was born in 1952, so I remember the book. Of course, I didn't read it, I was a kid, but I do think my mother read it. And I remember it being a sensational thing, that the whole experiment that he engaged in was unthinkable almost at the time. And I think, that probably was a factor in it getting the attention it got, which was a good thing because it did raise awareness, at least for people who weren't from the South and didn't understand the Southern culture and the Southern relationship with Blacks. Not that the North didn't have its own issues, but certainly what Griffin describes in the book is I think the extreme, especially how it existed in Mississippi. And my thought about the narrative was, I was struck by how Black people had to live in two worlds. And I remember especially the description of their being on the bus, and how there was this subtle communication between and among the Blacks that was different from the communication that they had, if any, with whites. And so they jumped from world to world, or layer to layer, to just exist in everyday happenings. And I'd like to hear what Marty has to say about that in terms of, 2 decades later when he was growing up, was that his experience, that there was this sort of one way you act and communicate with each other when there are whites around, and another when it's just Black people together?
Okay, if it's all right, I can go ahead and answer that. Well, first of all, I said about the unthinkable things. I remember as a fifth grader, I attended Roach School there on William Street. And there was a friend of mine, was a white guy by the name of Roger Wilder. And there was a Black kid at that time, one Black guy in particular, who was wanting to fight Roger. And I stood up for Roger. I did take a whoop that day, so that Roger I consider to be a friend. But after I stood up for Roger, it seemed like there was a problem with me then with some Black kids in the community, because that was something you weren't supposed to. And even to this very day, I experience this two world that the John talked about, because I have to cater to both the Black community and I have to cater to the white community. And sometimes you find yourself one group getting mad at you because you're working with another group. So today it's almost a double. It's a dang if do and a dang if don't. And it's hard because my way of thinking is that this is our community. It's not a Black community. It's not a white community. It's our community. And so when I get involved in our community, I don't try to see Black. I don't try to see white. I try to see the community as a whole. Yes, I do still see the two worlds. I hope I answered your question.
John, did you have something to say? John Keck? Okay, we'll come back to
Yeah,
John.
let me go ahead and, sorry, okay. I was getting to my mute button.
That's okay.
Yeah, so yeah, as I was kind of reflecting on the reading itself and some of those moments that seemed kind of almost over dramatic, I was kind of reminded of, of someone who's very enthusiastic to really support a particular people group, but almost kind of overdoing it in the sense of he's trying to be so empathetic that it comes off as less than genuine at times. For me, what kind of offset that was really the afterword, where he really he continued on in the fight for civil rights and was going all. I mean, he was a part of it, so that gave me, it kind of offset that feeling for me that I initially had, where it's like, oh, this guy's just being dramatic. He's doing too much, particularly in scenes like when he's talking about sitting down, writing a letter to his wife, and recognizing his blackness, that the self-perpetuated blackness as creating a barrier. And my wife and I actually discussed that particular passage, and we're like, well, that's, I mean, I get what he's trying to communicate here, and to take this and trying to make it very serious about the experience of being Black in the South. But on the other hand, that's kind of projecting some things onto that experience that aren't really genuine to, I mean, he can still on paper write down as the husband to this wife and exist in a way that he wouldn't be able to exist maybe as he stepped out if he were to speak to her. So that was kind of some of my reflections on your initial question.
Thanks, John. Mary, did you have a comment? You had your hand raised.
Sorry, I couldn't find it. I'm not on my iPad and I'm not used to this, and I have a new puppy that's running around here. Anyway, I apologize. I'm speaking from the point of an oldster. I did read the book when I was in grade school, and I was born in 1956. So I think I probably read it, I'm guessing, when I was 10 or 11. I was not old enough to understand what I was reading, but it was the whole time when, Martin Luther King and the rioting and all that kind of stuff was going on. And as a child, and I was a child then, I was petrified. We had, when I would go to school, we would go to school, I went to Catholic school. And when we would attend school, our teachers would get us all, revved up about when the summer comes, this is going to be terrible. All these writings are going on, and all this awful stuff is happening in our community. I came from Rockford, and it was really very frightening. I had one teacher that had us read this book, and it's funny now because I loved it. I loved the book. I loved reading it. We had kind of basically a white population in our school. We had a few Black kids, but we did not have, it was, like I say, it was Catholic school. And so the teacher that I had was very much into the civil rights movement at the time. And I had a good friend whose father marched on Washington. And so she was very much into it. So it kind of got me in that mindset as well. And when I read it, silly as it may sound, the thing that I remember the most out of the book was when he said that he had to shave his hands because the hair was growing out and it was not, it didn't look right. And I remember wondering about that. And as I read more, I didn't think it was sensationalized at all, only because at that time in 1968, this was new territory to everyone. This was not, we didn't understand anything. We didn't understand, people were, I often wonder, and my husband and I have commented on this before, what was it that took our parents' generation that was just so bigoted and so not open to any discussion? And then when our generation came and we were like, this doesn't make sense, this isn't right. And it took us to a different level. And like I say, my friend and her father really made a huge difference on me as well. But as I read the book again for the second time now as an old person, and I remember back to those days, that was how everybody thought. And I can honestly see him wondering as he's reading and writing and talking with people, and the passion, because I saw that passion in other people. There was it's almost impossible to describe, but it was such a difficult time for understanding. People just didn't, They didn't want to understand. They didn't want to open their hearts. They didn't want to open their minds. And so when there were those who did, such as in this book, we were mesmerized by it. We were taken into a world that we had never experienced before. And I felt like every detail he gave, every explanation that he had, every person that he met and that he dealt with and that he engaged with, whether it's positive or negative, meant something very important to those who were reading it. I loved it. I mean, I again, you know how it is when you're nostalgically looking back at your childhood and you remember something from it that was positive and gave me such a positive view. And then to read it again, and I'm telling you, I couldn't wait for this discussion. I was so impressed with what happened. My question is it any different? Is it any different now? Because we talk about, oh, everybody understands now, we're just all these open-minded, wonderful people. I don't think we are. I don't think we have gotten to that point yet. But do we feel, is it easier for those in the Black community to express their views openly at this point? Or do you still feel like you have to mask yourself? Do you still feel like you have to turn into someone else when you're in one situation and turn back? I think we all do that to a point, but did this book over all these years make a difference? I guess is what I'm saying. To me, it did. It made a huge difference. I'll never forget the experience, but I don't think a lot of people remember it anymore. It just doesn't seem to be in vogue anymore. I don't know. To me, I thought it was so engaging. I loved it. So thank you.
I would like to chime in if I could. Mary, you asked a question about things being passed down, like your father's history or your great-grandparents' history. Well, people will take, at time, people will take scriptures from the Bible and use them to argue the point that Black man was inferior by nature, and would talk about curse that was put on Noah's son, the children of Ham. And that's the argument that they would use. But also, there was this Greek philosopher by the name of Aristotle. And Aristotle set a formula. And he would have a minor, minor premises. And his minor premises was that all men were made in the image of God. And then he say that, as we know, God is not a black man. Then his conclusion was that the Black man could not be a man. That Black person couldn't be a man. So some history had been passed down and practiced. So to answer your question, I believe this is why it has went far as it did, because of people being educated and they were being educated.
Thank you. And Mary, that was a really interesting perspective, having read it when you were younger and then now again. Really interesting perspective. Other thoughts on, so we have one stance that, that there was sensationalism. Mary talks about, the sensationalism was warranted because he was so passionate, right, in wanting to get people to understand. What about the effectiveness of his experiment? Was this convincing to people? So Mary gave her perspective as a reader. What are your thoughts?
Hi, this is Amanda. I was going to say that I based on what he experienced after he published the book, that it seems like it definitely had an impact, positive and negative. It got people talking, and it opened eyes and ears to situations that were happening. And I mean, I felt like he really started this by saying, is this really happening? Is this people keep saying that these situations are occurring, but I want to really experience it for myself. And when you look back at the time period of 1959, and the book we read previously, Emmett Till, was 1955, and he's choosing to experience this, I think that has a strong impact. I mean, just knowing that someone willingly put themselves in a situation that he couldn't be sure that he would be safe. So I feel like it was worthwhile, and that his experiment was successful. I really was struck by how much he struggled with his own identity when he was writing, is that the trouble that he was having going back and forth between his white self and his black self. Like, I think this was more towards the end of the book, when he was using more stain to kind of cover up, because he was turning more, his skin was lightening without the treatments. And John mentioned how he struggled writing to his wife, and I felt like he was struggling because he couldn't identify with his original self anymore, and so he couldn't relate to that man because he was so involved in this other life that he created for himself. And I don't know, I just found the whole thing really profound and scary and exciting and interesting, and I felt like it was very worthwhile. Sorry, I kind of rambled, but I'll let somebody else talk now.
I think for me, one of the things that I thought was really effective about it is that the only thing he changed about himself was his skin tone. He left everything else about himself the same, and you could see the difference between how he was treated as a white man, being able to go wherever he needed to go, and if he wanted to get something to drink, he could just go get something to drink, and just the reverse of that, and how different it was as a black person trying to do the same things. And that was the only difference with him. He told everyone that he was a reporter. He didn't change anything else about himself besides that.
Absolutely. Tamithia, you agree? You mentioned in the chat.
I do. I think that was probably one of the best parts, is because often people say, oh, maybe it wasn't that, or maybe it had nothing to do with race, or maybe you took it wrong, or maybe you. And so with him only changing that one thing, it kind of, it quiets all of the what ifs or the, but, a lot of times we don't want to accept that it is racism, but he left nothing to wonder. It could have only been his race because he didn't change anything else.
I don't know if anybody watched any videos of him after the book and his subsequent lectures and all that he went. I thought that was even more fascinating to see that this kind of ruined his life doing this. He kind of put himself in a position where he was rejected by both communities in one way or another. And when he tried to kind of defend what he did, there was just a lot of his family, the torture that they went through, and how they were looked on, and his lectures that he went and gave at different settings where he was discounted, just totally. He was treated kindly to a point until he ruffled some feathers, and then all of a sudden now he was the vicious enemy. And he still, to me, what it seemed like to me was that he stuck to his guns, and he kept at he held true to his to what he did all of his life, and then his family after that supported him. I was really fascinated by the follow-ups to his life after the book was written and what happened. And I watched lots of different videos of him, which was really cool to watch him and talking about, you know, his blindness. And then when he, you know, what had happened to him after that, that had to play a huge part in his experience, the fact that he originally was blind and then he got his sight and then he was able to go out and do this. So I think the book was wonderful, but I think the before and the after was really helpful to me too, to understand even more about what he went through and the difference that he did make. Sorry, didn't mean to occupy everything. Like I said, I just love this book.
I think one of the, I read this book when I was, I think in college, when it first came out. And I actually didn't remember much of anything from it when I reread it. So it was like reading it new. And I thought it was really very interesting. And I think perhaps sometimes those of us who read it when it first came out sort of didn't really discount things, but thought, this is the South. He's describing what life in the South is like. And most of us hadn't spent much time in the South, so we didn't really have that personal experience of not being able to communicate across race. But even in Decatur in the 50s and 60s, you know, I went to dentist school and I went to Woodrow Wilson and MacArthur High School, and there were very few Blacks during that time in Decatur. But it was during the 50s and 60s that there was a large migration into the city of Decatur. And I think that also changed the experiences of people here. So it's just, I appreciated reading the book again because it made a completely different effect on me because of what has happened during the intervening time.
So Kay mentioned in the group chat that she was really curious about Griffin's relationship with his wife after this. The wife was obviously supportive when he did it, but she wondered, since he said he had a hard time writing to her, what that kind of effect would have been on his wife and family. I mean, we can chat that through. What are your thoughts about how tough or different or difficult that might have been for his family? So another idea, John mentioned that, and I agree, the most uncomfortable parts of reading the book were in relationships to the assumed hypersexuality of Black men, as well as the normalization of sexual abuse of Black women seeking employment. Perspectives on that, discomfort at any point during that for anyone else, or confirmation or an aha moment during those sections of the reading?
Hi, this is Marcy Rocky. And so I was just going to say, this conversation is making me think about racial battle fatigue. And I don't know if anybody has read, you know, from Dr. William Smith, who coined the name of racial battle fatigue, but thinking about, because one of the things too, when I was reading the book, was kind of thinking like, well, he's as much as he's sort of putting himself in a position to experience this identity, he is not that identity. And so kind of from a critical way thinking, you know, but I think as we were talking, I was just thinking about that, the psychological impact and the way in which, you know, he lived this in a very short time as another person. But then, you know, he was never really a Black man. And so thinking about in terms of, I guess I was just thinking about it highlighting racial battle fatigue in the sense of what it is like to live as a racially oppressed person, and even how that continues today, and the health effects and the psychological effects, and we see that in data on health outcomes on, you know, in lots of different ways. So I'm going to try to find an article, or I can share a link where Dr. Smith talks about this, but that's what I was thinking about during our conversation. And also even today where, you know, if I speak in my office, we do a lot with racial equity and higher education, and often hearing people say, well, that doesn't happen at our college, you know, or students don't feel like that, but they do. You know, and sort of that denying the experiences, you know, of other people and thinking, well, you know, the whole idea of, well, it can't be race, you know, or we don't have a race problem here, but we can look at your data and your outcomes and see that you do have racial equity gaps, and that those are systemic and historical. So I don't know, I'm kind of rambling too, but just, I'm going to see if I can find a video or an article to share from Dr. Smith, because it really gets to the impact on, you know, health and psychologically, and I think you saw that in the book as he was living, you know, in a different identity.
Hi, this is Cindy Bard-Laban. I want to comment on what John wrote about the hypersexuality of Black men, and that was something that I had not thought about before. Maybe the aha moment, Julia, that you talked about is that for as far as what John talked about was that the way for the Black men to express their masculinity, they couldn't do that through employment, through providing for their family, or through an education. All of those opportunities were pretty limited. And so what they had left is their sexuality. And then that is how their manhood and masculinity was expressed. And that was a new thought for me. And that was something interesting that I learned here.
Well, there's also I mean, when we look at the topic of lynching, it's so often in the policing of white women. It's the assumption that Black males are a threat to to white women. It was kind of the consistent refrain. It's that protection there, and then you see, I believe it was in the car when he was hitchhiking, where there's this guy who's basically baiting him into saying, "Hey, tell me that you're," almost saying, "Please tell me you're attracted to white women," and it's almost like you can sense this underlying threat that's really being prodded here. It's almost like, you know, if I don't give you what you want, then I feel threatened because you want a certain answer. But if I answer the way you want, I also am risking my well-being, because if I say, yes, I'm attracted to white women, like you're baiting me to say, then you may kill me. You know, if I say something that seems too presumptuous, that I've had an experience or something, then it's like, this could be the end of my life.
I read this book too, as a teenager in high school. And it was just a few years after integration had happened in our community. And there was a small number of African American students who had come to our school. And for whatever reason, it just really opened my eyes in an empathetic way to what they might be experiencing. And it had a profound effect on my life. And it's always been a little challenging for me when people don't see that through an empathetic lens, and remain kind of blind to it, like many of the people were that he encountered. So I really enjoyed reading it again. It was like coming home to a really foundational place in my life. But I had the same question that the first person mentioned, is how much has it really changed? And I guess that maybe that's back to Marty in terms of what are the gains that maybe he has seen, and how can we continue the gains that have been made in terms of being more empathetic to that reality of the two worlds.
I thought it was interesting too, and I think we can change some here, where they would accept critique from him when they wouldn't other Black men or other Black women in the group. And I don't know that that has changed a lot, but think that's something we can change if we catch ourselves talking for someone else in a lot of different realms, but particularly in the racial realm.
If I could chime in and answer a question, what I've seen thus far, I've seen the races have come together, open dialogue, talking about differences, talking about things that bother other people is most definitely a great start, because sometimes people, especially in the Black culture, the African American Blacks, they have this wall, and we won't let anyone get in there to hurt us. We've been hurt within, we built this wall. And so I see there's been significant changes throughout the world, not only in this community, but I do know that some of the things that go on in the Black community, it's not a race thing, it's more environmental thing. When people, the Black people or whoever in poverty, when they're hurting, then their only response to react to that is to act out violence. So I do see significant change that I've seen now. Dr. King, he's always wanted the Blacks, the whites, the males, females, everybody to go.
That's an interesting point. I was thinking of another book that I read called Nickeled and Dimed, and that woman did something very similar with an experiment. She was a journalist, but she made a commitment to work minimum wage jobs and live on minimum wage, basically. And so for her, and she was surprised that she thought that she would easily give away from her vocabulary and things like that, but people didn't even notice. She just showed up for a minimum wage job, and they treated her like, she didn't have any education, and She wasn't even really there. And I think, that wasn't necessarily related to race as much as it was oppression. And just kind of living for a moment in a situation of oppression, which I think race is one of those, but I think there are a variety of ways that people are oppressed. Being sensitive to them as real people. So that's just an interesting thought I've had.
So we've teetered a little bit on this idea of how much has it really changed. And I really was thinking about the perspective of Griffin and his actual choice, conscious choice to decide to do this. And I even began to think, I also thought about, the perspective of what that looks like now, and the potential choice for something like that to happen now. I mean, would it be as effective now? Could it have an effect now? Is that even a choice that could be made? Again, as a social experiment, I see, kind of like Marty said, darned if you do, darned if you don't, on both sides as far as an outcome. For instance, if something like that happened today.
I think the hard part about it is that we see it every day on Facebook and in interactions, and you still don't see that change in people. Like, they're watching videos of, all of these things happening. Like, you can't ignore that. And so I think back then it was more effective because we didn't have social media and you didn't have like recordings of all these things going on. And so for me, it gets frustrating because what else are we supposed to do? Like, you're seeing it on your screen. Like, how many other ways can you argue about this? And so I don't know that it would be effective now. It would be an interesting experiment, I guess. But I don't know. It's frustrating for me that more people are not more aware.
Marcy mentioned earlier the thought, she said specifically in higher education, but the thought that, we don't have a problem, that's a really easy fix. And I personally, I see that a lot, right? And I think that makes that population of people feel better to make an assessment and say, well, we've made an assessment and we've just decided there is not an issue. And then move on, but obviously, Brandy, like you say, there clearly is an issue, and not addressing it really doesn't make a change, right?
I wonder sometimes though, like if we are backstepping over things that we did kind of in the middle, because we had the civil rights movement and there were things that were starting to change. And then all of a sudden we were like, everyone's the same, we don't see color. And that wasn't the way to fix it either. And so now we're like, there are tons of people that have been educated that way. And I'm not racist because I don't see color and I don't do this. And now we're having to almost backstep and be like, but that's not okay either. Like, we're all different. It's okay. And so I think that we have made changes. It just wasn't necessarily in a way that was sustainable or even healthy.
Yeah, I think this is Marcy again. I think it does kind of even the way, so I'm 40. So thinking about how, what we teach and what we don't teach, that I think that's really important to think about. And I was actually impressed to hear people say when the book came out, they were reading it in school, because I've never read this book until now. And I've written some different things even through, the work that I do, but kind of how I even came to understand systemic racism and institutional racism and what that means and how it manifests. And I'm losing my train of thought. But thinking about what we don't teach, and even with my kids now, they come home, with nationally produced curricular materials. I'll give you a specific example very recently, of coming home with a handout about the Great Migration being where, Black people from the South came to the North to cities like Detroit and Chicago and found good jobs and nice homes. No, they didn't, but that's what my kids are bringing home still, and that's a nationally produced thing. So when we think about like, what does our textbook say? And you can even look at lawsuits happening right now, where people, and this whole idea of, are we honestly teaching about who people were and, who's not taught about? It wasn't until I was in college as an undergraduate that I even learned about Black women in the civil rights movement, or Black women that founded historically Black colleges and universities. I didn't even know those existed outside of watching A Different World. You know what I mean? So like, just the things that we don't teach and we don't talk about are very problematic. So I think that's a huge part of this, is that we're not taught to understand this. And that's purposeful, right?
I'm impressed, Marcy, that you even say that your children are bringing home material. And I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I mean, certainly anybody who's a person of color on the call can comment on what I'm about to say. But I did not learn hardly anything regarding Black history in school. I also am 40, Marcy. And everything that I learned, my parents taught me at home. They provided curriculum for me and talked to me. And that's very much how we've addressed it with our children here as well. They have gotten very little. And Marcy, what they have gotten has been, I guess, the typical, so Martin Luther King, right? So everybody gets Martin Luther King. And it's just very little and not a lot of substance, I think. So I'm agreeing with you, Marcy, definitely in regards to the education. Yes, and the MLK quotes that make people feel good. Absolutely.
This is Tamithia. I'm 42. That was also my experience. So I got everything at our public library. My parents did not give that to me because they were racism is over. Everybody's the same parents. So I was raised in the 90s, and that is how we dealt with racism in our home. We didn't talk about it because it was over. My grandparents took care of that. And so for me, it came through personal experiences, very uncomfortable personal experiences. And I was like Marcy, I was in undergrad as a college student. And I remember thinking, what about the kids that don't go to college? Because where I'm from, most kids don't. I'm first generation college graduate. So where I'm from, most kids don't go to college. And I just remember how life-changing it was for me as a college student. And then I just wanted more and more. But I always worry about our children of all races that don't ever get to see Black people in a light that way.
And those classes too, like even the classes that I took, and when we think about the importance of, teaching Black history and that, and even, supporting African-American studies departments, but that those things should be taught to everyone, and that even in those classes where we were exploring those things, this would have been the late 90s. And I'm from an all-white, small rural town. And so being confused when I went to that class and thinking, why am I the only white kid in this class? Because all my other classes, it was all white kids, And so again, thinking even about how, pushback when colleges try to require certain courses on diversity or on race, you know, and to this day, you know, the pushback and the, you know, we don't need to teach about that, or, you know, there's a lot of parallels to discussions, I feel like, when we look at any kind of like change, and even in this book and others. And right now I'm watching Mrs. America, about the ERA, and sort of the idea, we see the same language applied to, like, you know, moments where we're trying to think about advancing racial justice, or equality, and it becomes this idea of like communism and socialism, and sort of the words that are used to say, well, this is what's going to happen, you know, and some of you were talking about those like fear tactics, right? I feel like there's a lot of parallels in the books that we've been reading in different time periods to even now, to try to get people to, you know, be afraid of change, or saying, we don't need change, or this is what's going to happen, you know, if we do this.
I had some people post questions on Facebook about when was the first time that you had a Black teacher or a teacher of color. And, you know, I have postgraduate work done. I have not had one teacher ever in my life, and I'm older than 42. But so I think that when you talk about teaching the curriculum, I mean, we've got to get rid of the notion that it is Black History Month. It's everybody. We're all one country, and we need to hear both sides of the story. We only hear one side of every story. We only hear one side of it, and it's really not. It's not giving everybody an adequate education. I mean, some of the things that we've read in the books, this is like new to me, and I think that an injustice was served in our education by omitting all these such important points that we have. And I think, and I kind of want to ask Marty this, I think that the experience that the author had when he, you know, went undercover, like, so to speak, was accurate, and that was probably a typical way that Black people were treated then. Is that right? You're muted still. There we go.
Marty, we can't hear you still. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Do you want to try to go off and come back on? That worked for you last time. Okay, he's going to come back. Christine, before Marty gets back, yeah, I mean, I think it's, so you mentioned, you know, Black teachers, and you also mentioned the entry of this kind of a discussion in classrooms. So, I mean, those are all great points. You know, like you said, you know, there is this, all of this is new information for you as an educator, for instance, right? And I do think that someone is going to have to be A, comfortable discussing, and be knowledgeable, right, in discussing the information. And I think that's a problem. So I've thought about this very early. That was a question that came up early for me as well. I did not have a Black teacher until my PhD program. And I always found that a true injustice, you know, that did not happen.
Okay, can you hear me,
Oh,
Julia?
yes, Marty, we can hear you now.
I'm gonna have to go buy a new phone. uh, um, Christina, what you were saying earlier, yes, what he alluded to depicts what was going on at the time. But when you all were talking about the education part about not being in the text, the history not being told, well, I have books like The Black Pioneer of Science, The Pedology of Oppressed, Black Church History. So sometimes we have to educate ourselves. Even as a Black male, I still have to read so I can continue to educate myself so that I'm not left in the dark and saying, okay, this is the way that a Black person think, and that's the only way. I have to be open-minded. But I really agree that more contributions need to be put in the textbooks so that people learn more about the contributions that the Blacks have made to this country.
And I kind of had one other question too, which is, I think it was Marcy who was talking about, that, when you say that there's no problem with racism and you just kind of ignore it. And then you go and you read WAND and the Herald and Review, all the comments underneath whatever they post. And then you're kind of like, that's actually not the case then, because that's disgusting that some of you guys are not only thinking these things, but posting them in a public forum. So then that leaves you with the thought of, it's really, what can you do if to get someone to understand what it's like to be in somebody else's shoes, if they're not thinking that way, and an experiment like what Griffin did is not something that's going to happen. So then what can you do to bring some greater changes about?
In college, I did attend Martin University, and surprisingly, my instructor was Dr. Derek King. He was the nephew of Martin Luther King. And one of the things that we studied was you never knock down another person's religion or belief, but you try to understand why they believe what they believe. So if there's a question, then open dialogue. Because if you don't know, you don't know. And there's a saying that the stupidest or the dumbest question is the one not asked. And so I'm pretty sure that the way things are now, that you can approach people in the right manner and have some open dialogue.
I don't suggest that in the WAND comments, though. I'll just say that. So I had my first Black teacher in undergrad also, and he was my African American studies teacher. So that was my first experience. I am a teacher, and I have the pleasure of being a Montessori teacher, and we study and learn and love and appreciate all cultures. So I'm not bounded by the textbook the way that some teachers are. We have this thing that we call windows, doors, or windows, mirrors, and sliding doors. So the goal is for children to always see themselves in everything that we do. So that's science, literature, whatever. It's always to look through a window and take a peep inside of someone else's life, but it's also to open the sliding door and walk into the space that someone else experiences. And we start that with our kids at like 4 years old. But everyone thinks they're crazy. So, but I agree. It's not in the textbooks. I certainly didn't get it. I didn't get it until college. And had I not gone, I would have never gotten it. I don't think so.
One of the things that I think of too, talking about the WAND post and everything, and we're talking about how much things have changed, if they've changed. And when I think back to the book, you know, the interactions that he had with the people were in the, you know, confines of a car. It was one-on-one versus, you know, you see what people are posting on Facebook and on WAND, and they can say those things in public. What kind of conversations would you be having with those people one-on-one in a car versus out in public? You know, has it really changed? I'm not that confident that it has.
I have to agree with you on that. I don't know why my picture's not showing up here. Something happened. My dog, I think, stepped on my thing. I'm sitting on the grass. I apologize. I have to agree with you. I think I went to school in Oklahoma, and that was the first African-American teacher I had for government. And she was wonderful. And she opened, and it wasn't African-American studies or anything like that. This was 1975 or 74, but it was just a government class where we picked up on things. My feeling on a lot of this, the posts that people post on Facebook, the comments that they make when the governor speaks or when they're watching something, people have a really good way of hiding themselves. And I think they've learned that a lot nowadays. I think that you see, when I went to school in Oklahoma, I mean, it was a real eye-opener for me. And coming from the North, that's not to say everything was perfect, but the whole demeanor when it came to my roommate and her family, who were wonderful people, and I really came to know them well. They were two different people when it came to their family discussions and their discussions about just regular life as compared to their discussions about race. They were like two polar opposites. I was so stunned to hear the commentary, and I only stayed for a semester, and then I left and came back home again. But when we look at some of these things that are going on, sometimes we say, oh, this is typically in the South, and only the South would have done such and such, and in the North things were a lot better. I'm not so sure I believe that. I think that like I say, there are just, sometimes we have a way of hiding what we say and keeping our comments. We've seen that a lot with all the controversy that's been going on now in the news about people from the 80s and from the 90s and different parties and things that they've attended and things they've said and things that they've done. And then they come off as being so saintly. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful or anything, but it just really bothers me to see that so many of us can truly be, the term two-faced is right there. It just depends on your crowd. If you're within a crowd where you have to behave a certain way, you do. And if you're in a crowd where you don't have to, and you feel like your inhibitions have been lifted a little bit, then that different personality comes out. And all of a sudden, if that gets discovered by someone, if that gets discovered by people that you know are trying to expose you for whatever reason, then, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean it. I think that sometimes we have to be really careful, that we need to do some soul searching here. And if we are going to commit ourselves to a particular opinion or a particular viewpoint, we better be pretty sure that this is where we are, because this two-faced thing of, I'm going to act one way in one crowd and I'm going to act another way in another crowd, depending on who I'm around, that comes back to haunt us. And I think that we see that a lot. I think I see that more today than I ever saw in growing up. And growing up, everybody was just pretty vocal about their feelings. They didn't care who heard what they said, my dad in particular. And now we look and we see people putting this mask on and then getting caught without it someplace else. And to me, that's almost worse, because that is something that, how do you combat that? Does anyone, how do you know who's friend or foe here? And that's the thing I think that's most disturbing to me when we have these discussions, even, and we talk about, Emmett Till, and we talk about Monster, and I have to share that when the first book, Race Manners, I got the name wrong when I was getting it on Audible, and I said Race Matters by Cornel West. And so that's the book that I read. Holy cow, he's my age, and he was right on point on a lot of things. And I almost felt like he was being very vocal about what he was saying, just because he's running out of time and I got to get my message out here and everybody needs to listen. But there were so many things I kept saying, okay, you got to be open-minded about this. You need to listen to it. And I picked up on a lot of good stuff when it came through and things that opened my eyes. I feel like that two-faced viewpoint that many of us either have or experience is what's getting us into big trouble now. And that's where we've gone back. We've taken the steps backward instead of forward because we've just learned how to hide it. And that's scary to me. That's frightening to me.
So I don't want to specifically speak to media, although you might have a good perspective on this, but any teachers on the call, is there do you recognize a push in any way or a recognition, that maybe more diversity does need to happen in educators, period, I guess, are you aware of any sort of focus on recruitment? I know Tiffany even mentioned that she felt like there were, she said that in school, Mr. Cruz, that Stephen Decatur was her first Black teacher. She thinks that there were more Black teachers back then than there are now.
I don't know the number of Black teachers we have in our current school district. I do know that there have been recruiting and trying to retain Black teachers for a very long time. The issue is the pay is terrible. And if you're going to go to college for 4 years, something that your family has worked hard to put you through, you don't want to make what a teacher makes. So a lot of people, especially of color, don't choose education because if you're going to spend that much money on a bachelor's degree, you want to make more than what a teacher makes.
Hey y'all, I'm Amy. John just mentioned in the chat just about representation. And I know from my own history, I also grew up in Oklahoma, in Tulsa, and attended a historically Black junior high and high school, George Washington Carver Middle School, where we had to memorize all 105 uses of the peanut that Dr. Carver came up with, and Booker T. Washington High School. And so I never really, like in my memory, I have no memories of not having a Black principal, of not having, almost all my teachers were Black. And so that sense of normalcy in my own mind of those voices as the people that I look to for guidance, for insight, for their expertise in so many different things is really important. And so I'm thankful, I was a kid, so I just took that for granted. I think the one thing that was missing though for me, even back then to now, that is one place I've been really growing is just my own sense of white fragility. That's of course Robin DiAngelo's most recent book, but this sense of not ever really being called out on my own white privilege and how that of course, like that anti-racism work is not only noticing, like as Black Like Me does, lifting up the oppressed, like the oppression that is happening all the time, systemically and actively towards others, but also that I benefit from that system and that Black Like Me, he does raise that. I mean, he tells that story of just how he's realizing what a privilege it is to be a white person and his time to just walk in and eat whenever he wants or go to the bathroom whenever he wants. But I think some of that ongoing work is just really, really important in this day and age to just even, I'm trying to do a lot of that personally, but also communally about just recognizing, I am judged positively, or I have certain assets that just come because of the color of my skin, and that's not right. And that facing that and trying to dismantle that is really important. And that's, at least for me, that's something really new.
Hey, Julie, somebody had mentioned earlier, I don't know who it was, but mentioned something about media, what role the media plays in it. And I just pulled some clippings. In 1905, it was the Decatur Herald, it wasn't the Herald Review. But when they had something that they wanted to report, and if it was a colored person, they would title it Colored Boy Gone. Or if there was a specific death, they would write in the obituary the person name, and they would put colored. And so, but you don't see that in today's paper. So they have progress as well. So, but these are some of the things that were put in the paper back in the 900s. So it hasn't been that far back that we've been dealing with some of this.
So there was, and again, I don't remember who exactly mentioned it. It's been mentioned a couple of times, but we've talked about masking a little bit, and even that, Griffin talks a little bit about that invisibility, right? So the ability to go back and forth, between the two races, and there does seem to be more of a boldness, I think, with masking your ideas or thoughts, whether that be a comment on Facebook or like in reality, what the thoughts are of someone. And I think that, with everything that's gone on, I think there's kind of sometimes more of a freedom for people to feel like they can say whatever it is that thought is, even if it might be non-empathetic and racist, even if it gets to that point, and I think that's a tough pill, to use John's words, to swallow, having to feel like you are hyper aware of everyone and their feelings and not knowing if what's coming out of their mouth is true.
I'm laughing because we're having the debate about who's going to say, well, it's easy for that to happen whenever it's coming from the White House and Twitter on a daily basis on who was going to pull the trigger and say it. And so I think that sometimes that gives people boldness because they see the supposed leader of our country doing the same things. And so, we're in a time. You're going to hear them. We're in a time where everything is so divided. And so, this is what happens when anybody walks up to our door. So, but we're in a time that's so divided. And so if you're, anti-racist, then you're against the country, supposedly, or you're against the cops. It just is, I feel like a crazy time to be an American and really trying to figure out how that looks. Like with the mask that you're talking about, I think that it just, I don't know. I lost my train of thought. All that dog barking just really blew my mind. So if anybody needs dogs, I have 3. They're up.
Yeah, but to your point, Brandy, the fact that we have leaders, and really, I would say that really the kind of extreme right-wing media has kind of was kind of the precursor to what we have in the White House right now. It's kind of one has led to the other, that there's been this voice to these kind of extreme views that are kind of anti-immigrant, they're anti-Black, they're but used in a more coded sort of language, that anytime, D.L. Hughley came on Fox News and was in debate with Megyn Kelly, and he presented something that was rather shocking, where he said, I don't believe that Fox News has ever seen a black man that they didn't think deserved it. And I mean, people were offended about that, but it also kind of cut through some of the flowery language or the redirections that were taking place, because it really was that every time there was a officer involved shooting, or there was a black person that was victimized, that there was always an excuse for why that was justified. And when you have those messages over and over again, it's hard to empathize with those that are, literally suffering.
I also sort of think that, and I can only speak for me as a person of color, but I think it is you get really good at picking up on or recognizing, even though, like John says, that coded language or even a lie, you really get good at telling if it's a lie or if it's the truth, and I think sometimes it's disheartening and frustrating. I have 3 kids also, so it's very loud over here, sorry. But they're getting very rowdy. But it's also you are very hard on yourself, I think, if you do get to the point where you do get fooled, because you kind of pride yourself on getting good at recognizing what's someone's truth and what they're just telling you, if that sort of makes sense. And again, I want to speak for myself in that I don't know that that is everyone's experience, but for me personally.
I absolutely agree with you on that. I think that a lot of that can cross all barriers. I had a very, very good friend for 20 years that betrayed me in a horrible, horrible way, and I was so taken back. And I thought I knew people. I thought I could look at someone and figure out, like you say, that whether they were being truthful, whether they, were lying or cheating or whatever. And I was totally overtaken with this experience, and it made me doubt myself. Maybe I don't know. Maybe I can't judge people. Maybe I can't look at people. And a friend of mine told me once that she felt that most people are basically good. We're all basically good people, and we look for the good in other people. But there are some people who just aren't good. And sad to say, those people can sometimes take us to a point where we lose confidence in ourselves and in those around us, and we put up barriers that we shouldn't have because we've been wronged one time. And that's the difficult part for us to deal with, is that we don't like to doubt ourselves. We don't like to doubt that that we know what's going on in our lives. And I went through such a terrible depression because of that, because I thought, how in the world could this have happened to me? I'm an intelligent person. How could this happen? And I can only imagine if someone would feel betrayed simply because of the color of their skin, simply because of their family background, simply because of where they came from, and feel like they were used and abused and they didn't know it, and all of a sudden that was brought out. Or they were taken advantage of in a particular way. And my experience was nothing compared to what we're talking about here, and what those that went through this time period that Black like me came from, as well as nowadays, but especially then, since that's our discussion. I just don't think I can even imagine. I don't think that I can look at it and even ever in my whole life imagine. So the only thing I can do is talk and listen and hear what others have to say to help me understand what I just can't understand. So anyway, that I totally agree with you, Julia. I can see where that comes from, and I can see how that happens to us so easily. And it destroys our person and our spirit, which is again frightening to me.
If I could chime in on that, this has been my personal experience as a Black man, and I've tried to deal with other Black when it comes to business, And I've been done so wrong. And their attitude was like, I'm supposed to accept it and go along with it simply because we're both Black. And sometimes they try to make you feel as though you're the problem instead of the work that they've done for you. So that's something that I have to also face in this community, dealing with Black people as well. And sometimes, you know, they beat to the store. And so when people look at you now, you're the problem. It wasn't their work, you're the problem now.
Any other perspectives on Griffin's experience or experiment in relation to the times then, or perspectivizing now?
One of the things that stood out to me, I think the like, can't remember if it was called a postscript afterward, but it was really after that. There was just so much discussion about kind of the transition from being from white kind of anti-racist type people, really leading the conversations to an awareness of the importance of transitioning that power off to people of color. And it seems like that was for the author, it wasn't necessarily as challenging as some of the other leaders who had really kind of taken pride in their position of being able to kind of lead the conversation and lead the civil rights movement and the discussions on that. So I think that section did a great job of kind of defining what it means to be an ally, a white ally at a transitional period. Because there were times where it was important to speak up, because he had mentioned going on speaking tours with, other Black leaders who would say the very same things that he said, but they weren't heard. So it's kind of figuring out that balance of not speaking over people, but allowing, kind of being there to allow those voices to be heard more clearly, as opposed to talking over them. At least that's what I took away.
Thanks, John. I think, Leslie, are you able to get in? Can't hear you still. That help? Not yet. We'll allow Leslie to come in when she's able to. Anybody else? Thank you, John. That was a really good perspective. I'm going to open up just one more time, I guess, for any remaining comments on the text. As we're moving forward, really great conversation tonight, though, overall. I want Leslie to be able to talk. I also really enjoyed that so many new people felt free to share tonight. I thought that was really fantastic too. So thank you guys for stepping into your comfort zone and doing that. Leslie, do you maybe want to type a couple of comments in the chat? Maybe we can chat from that.
I think one of the things that really stuck out at me, I mean, there's so many things that stuck out at me, but just that sense of community within the Black community, the Black men, how they would interact with each other, and how they, you know, he was taken in by a family who didn't have anything to offer him, but they still took him in and shared their home with them, and, you know, gave him a place to sleep. And I just thought it was just very interesting to see how they came together as a community like that.
Leslie, why don't you feel free to maybe make a post in our page as a continuance of the conversation? We'd love to discuss, you know, whatever topic it is that, you know, you were wanting to discuss too. And everybody else, also feel free to share any links to any, you know, anything that was pertaining to our conversation tonight in the page. I think that's been really helpful for everybody to, you know, continue thoughts and conversations. But I really appreciate your time tonight, and please look to see the rest of the schedule as we continue to move forward with the rest of our readings. And I just really appreciate your time tonight. Marty, thank you again for your perspective, really interesting perspective. I appreciate you allowing us to kind of pick your brain a little bit and your experiences.
Well, thank you all for allowing me to participate.
Thank you, everybody. You have a good rest of the night.